It hadn't always been like this. There was an era when the people still lived under the glow of ancient promises, when the mornings began with thankful hearts and sacred names were whispered with awe. Those days were not perfect, but they were sincere. Slowly though, like embers losing their glow under a bed of ash, devotion faded. Not with rebellion, but with forgetfulness. The shift began subtly, wrapped in political change. A new monarch had risen, not by force, but by succession, and with him, the heartbeat of the nation shifted. He lacked resolve. His decrees held no conviction. His rule opened a door to foreign influence, an elegant figure cloaked in exotic silks and cunning ambition. She did not arrive alone. Alongside her came unfamiliar deities, foreign rites, and seers who spoke in riddles no one could understand. Soon, sacred hills bore altars to silent idols. Statues of stone and bronze demanded offerings without mercy. The god of their ancestors was no longer sought at dawn or remembered at dusk. In his place stood cold shapes carved by men, unblinking, unmoved, unholy. Once vibrant places of judgment turned into corridors of deception. Truth had become a foreign word, traded for flattery and indulgence. Incense still rose, but not in prayer. It was burnt in honor of false gods. The songs in the streets praised fertility, conquest, and dominance, but the melody of righteousness and mercy had vanished. The name that once filled their songs, the name of the God of Israel, had been replaced with hollow titles lacking power or meaning. Many fled to the outskirts, unwilling to play part in this descent. Others faded into shadows, and many more forgot entirely. Whispers persisted of a small remnant, faithful ones hiding in highlands and caves, keeping the ancient ways alive in secret. But they were only rumors, faint and easily dismissed. In most homes, the holy scrolls had become nothing more than furniture, covered in dust, untouched by hands or hearts. Within the palace, a phrase echoed like a mantra: "There is no longer a voice from the Most High." The queen, sharp and commanding, held the court in the palm of her hand. The king, passive, signed orders without reading. The people followed not out of trust, but out of fear or habit. And yet, in the depth of this spiritual dusk, where it seemed the heavens had chosen silence, someone appeared. Without banners, without entourage, just a man. His eyes calm, yet burning with something unseen. His words, when he spoke, struck like thunderclaps. He did not seek approval. He delivered a message: "There will be no dew, no rain, until I speak again." None knew his heritage. No familiar bloodline, no record in court. Yet there was something in his tone, a weight, a certainty that silenced even the skeptics. It was as though the sky had broken its silence through him. No noble recognized his face. His accent bore no trace of the capital, dressed not in fine robes but in rough cloth tied with a leather cord. He looked more like a shepherd than a prophet. And still, he walked like a man who carried destiny in his steps. Market vendors watched him pass by without a word. He purchased nothing. At the temple gates, he stood still. He did not kneel nor speak, but simply observed like someone revisiting a memory. He asked no one for lodging, nor greeted the priests. His movements were purposeful, precise. He wasn't wandering. He had a destination. When he arrived at the palace, the guards hesitated. Covered in dust, with eyes like fire, the stranger declared with authority, "Tell your king, I come under command of the God of Israel." His voice didn't plead. It commanded. Something about him made the soldiers step aside. Perhaps fear, perhaps awe. Moments later, he stood before the throne. No bow, no waiting for permission. He lifted his head and spoke with the force of a storm, breaking the silence of a long, dry night. "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain in this land unless I say so." The hall froze. The king narrowed his eyes, his expression a mixture of confusion and discomfort. The queen was absent, but her advisors whispered furiously among themselves. Who was this stranger that dared to speak with such confidence? Who was this man who challenged their gods without fear? But the man didn't wait for permission, nor did he explain himself. He had said what he was sent to say, and then he turned and walked away. No one dared stop him, no guards moved. He left behind a wake of unease, his footsteps echoing like distant thunder in the silence of the stunned court. Some muttered that he was mad. Others wondered if he had been sent by heaven, but no one followed, no one dared pursue. His presence vanished as quickly as it had come, and then the sky changed. The clouds that once clung lazily to the mountains began to disappear. Wells that had long quenched the thirst of the people started sinking into the earth. Cracks split the fields, and a quiet dread began creeping through the land. The people remembered the words of the dust-covered stranger, but none could find him again. It was as though he had melted into the wilderness. Tales of him spread like wildfire. Children whispered about the man who could speak to the heavens. Elders remembered fragments of prophecy. Some called him a prophet. Others gave him a name only spoken in hushed tones, the voice of the one true God. And as the drought grew more severe, all eyes turned upward in search of a sign. But the sky remained blank, silent and unshifting. In the early days, the warning had seemed like little more than theatrics. A dramatic gesture from a wild-eyed zealot, they said. Some mocked the strange man and his bold prediction. But as days stretched into weeks without a single drop of moisture, the laughter faded. Clouds no longer gathered. The morning dew, once a gentle kiss upon the land, vanished entirely. The breeze turned brittle and dry. The soil, once lush and full of life, began to wither. Crops browned under the sun. The wells dipped lower. Farmers raised weary eyes to the heavens and saw only stillness. An oppressive silence settled across the kingdom, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Streams dried into dust paths. The land split open. Herds of animals fell where they stood, their bodies too weak to rise. The earth, once generous, turned against them. Hunger crept into homes, first as a whisper, then as a scream. And still, the words of that unknown man lingered. No dew, no rain, until I say so. The king, now gripped by fear, issued orders to find him. Riders swept through the countryside. Scouts crossed borders, asking questions in every town, every inn, every mountain path. They searched caves, climbed ridges, interrogated strangers, but there was no trace. It was as if he had been a shadow, never truly there. Meanwhile, the queen's priests intensified their efforts. They lit greater fires, chanted louder, poured out more offerings. But the heavens remained closed. There was no response, no wind, no voice, just silence, deafening, unrelenting silence. Even those who had once mocked began to wonder, was he truly a messenger? The sun, relentless and cruel, beat down upon the people. Water became more valuable than gold. Mothers journeyed miles in search of a spring, returning empty-handed. The marketplaces, once alive with sound and color, turned into ghost towns. Laughter was replaced by weeping. Elders began telling stories they had long kept buried, tales of past generations when rebellion against the truth caused the skies to shut. Of times when a single man, speaking with divine authority, could command the elements and rewrite the fate of nations. The fear turned to reverence. No longer was he seen as a madman. Now he was spoken of as a holy man, a prophet, a vessel of the Most High. Though none knew where he had gone, hope clung to his last words. For if he had the power to declare judgment, perhaps he also held the key to mercy. But for now, the heavens remained silent. And just as the earth began to crack under the heat, a quiet directive stirred within the heart of the prophet. It was not thunderous nor spoken aloud, no visions in the sky or flashes of fire, only a silent, unmistakable instruction. Withdraw, not to flee, but to be shielded and to prepare. The judgment had barely begun. The destination was not marked on any map, nor was it reachable by the usual roads. It was a secluded ravine, hidden from human view, a place where no one wandered by accident. There, tucked between gnarled roots and hardened soil, beside a narrow stream flowing through rough stones, the prophet would encounter divine provision. He asked no questions. He simply obeyed. Guided by that quiet conviction that only those attuned to the voice of the Eternal can recognize, he walked. Hours, maybe days. Dust clung to his feet, and the only companions were distant birds and the rustling of dry leaves underfoot. At last he arrived. No shelters, no signs of civilization, just the soft sound of trickling water and the wind whispering through brittle branches. The stillness was not the most surprising thing. What truly astonished was how he was sustained. Each morning and evening, without fail, winged messengers descended from the skies. They did not carry scrolls or symbols, but nourishment. Bread, meat, delivered by ravens, creatures known for their cunning, not for compassion. Birds that normally fled from humans now came close, obedient to a purpose beyond their nature. It was strange, almost irrational, yet it was happening. While the drought tightened its grip across the land, he was not abandoned. There was no abundance, no comfort, but neither was there lack. In that quiet place, alone with creation and the Creator, the prophet was being shaped, not through grand miracles, but through quiet faith. He learned to wait, to trust without proof, to listen in silence. Time passed, and the brook began to shrink. The flow slowed to a whisper. Stones once hidden beneath the streambed emerged, sun-bleached and dry. Eventually, only a fragile thread of water slipped through the cracks. The haven that had sustained him was no longer enough. Then came the next command. Not shouted, not thundered, but pressed into his heart with divine clarity. Leave this place. He was not being cast out, but called forward, not to a safer region of his own land, but beyond its borders, to a foreign city steeped in idol worship. There a widow, a woman with nothing, had been chosen to sustain him. It made no sense. Why send him to someone with no resources, in a city devoted to other gods? Why not to a leader or a wealthy host? But the prophet did not argue. At dawn he rose, wrapped his cloak tightly around his shoulders, and stepped once more into the unknown. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not marked by glory, but by surrender. Because sometimes faith is not about performing miracles. It's about walking forward when everything around you says, "This is foolish." The city he approached was not known for kindness. It was part of a region where foreign rituals were practiced, and loyalty to the God of Israel was rare. Yet this unlikely place was where his next assignment waited. And his helper? A woman whose very existence seemed a contradiction to the task ahead. Near the city's entrance, he saw her. She was gathering sticks, fragments of broken branches, no doubt for firewood. Her movements were slow, wearied by hunger and fatigue. Her face bore the lines of sorrow, her clothes plain and worn. She moved with a heaviness that only loss could teach. There was no abundance in her arms, only resignation. With a gentle but steady voice, he called out to her, "Please, bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink." She didn't speak. She simply turned and began walking toward her home, perhaps out of habit or hope. But as she stepped away, he added, "And bring me a piece of bread as well." That second request made her pause. Slowly, she turned. Her eyes met his, not with anger, but with the ache of honest desperation. And then she spoke. "As surely as your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a few drops of oil in a jug. I was gathering wood to prepare what may be our final meal, one last bit for me and my son. After that, we wait for the end." Her voice was not bitter. She wasn't pleading. She was simply telling the truth. Life had become a quiet struggle against emptiness. Hope, once vibrant, had withered to almost nothing, and yet, unknowingly, she had just spoken to the very man sent to change everything. The prophet stepped forward, unshaken and calm. His voice did not carry sympathy, it carried purpose. What he offered was not pity, but a lifeline of faith. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Do as you planned. But first, take a bit of that flour and make a small loaf for me. Bring it to me. Then prepare something for yourself and your child. For this is what the Lord, the God I serve, declares. The jar of flour will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the rains return to the land." The woman watched him in silence. She could have turned away. She could have held tightly to the last of her resources. But something in his words touched a place long buried in her heart. Perhaps it was the certainty, or maybe, just maybe, it was the rare sound of someone speaking with real faith. And so she obeyed. She used what little she had, first for him, then for herself and her son. And when she returned to the jar, the flour was still there. The oil, too, remained untouched, as though the famine had forgotten that corner of the world. Day after day, the same miracle unfolded. There was never excess, never plenty, but there was always enough. Amidst a foreign city soaked in idolatry and drought, a nameless widow and a prophet without a home shared an invisible miracle that fed life where death reigned. Life settled into this quiet rhythm. Open the jar, just enough. Pour the oil, just enough. No more, no less. The woman approached each morning with trembling hands, half expecting the grace to have run dry. But it never did. That small corner of her home, once defined by absence, now held quiet hope. The prophet remained mostly silent. His days were filled with long prayers, stillness, watching the wind shift through the empty alleys. She, once guarded, began to see something sacred in his eyes. He was not like the men of her city, and what was happening under her roof could not be explained by reason. Her son, who once had little strength to rise, now played, ran, and laughed in the quiet spaces of the house. While the rest of the nation withered under heaven's silence, their home stood like a flickering candle, resisting a storm. No gold, no abundance, but breath and hope. One night, while the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and whispering through the empty streets, the woman sat beside the prophet. The oil lamp cast soft shadows across the walls. She stared into the flame, then looked at him and whispered, "I never thought I'd see this day, that my boy would live to see another sunrise." "Why me?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes as if listening to a voice deeper than sound. Then he opened them and replied, "It's not because of who you are. It's because of the one who sees what others overlook. He chooses the unlikely to reveal his power. He hasn't forgotten your house." Tears traced silent paths down her face. She said nothing, but her eyes glowed with gratitude and awe. A widow with no influence, chosen to protect a prophet. Her modest home, once filled with echoes of loss, had become a sanctuary of something sacred. But peace never lasts forever. As if faith must always be tested again, the shadow returned. One morning, without warning, the child grew ill. His breath became labored, his eyes dimmed. Despite her care, he slipped away, his body limp, his chest still. A scream tore through the silence. The mother rushed to Elijah, her voice sharp with pain. "Did you come to remind me of my sin, to take away the one thing I had left?" Elijah felt the full weight of her sorrow press upon his soul. He didn't try to explain. Instead, he took the child in his arms, climbed to the room above, and shut the door. He said nothing. He fell to his knees, forehead to the ground, and began to cry out, not with rehearsed words, but from a heart breaking open. It was life itself that hung in the balance. And in that silence, the prophet waited for heaven to move again. 3 years had passed since the sky had closed. The mountains were brittle. The rivers had become fading memories. The scent of scorched earth filled the air, mingling with the despair of a people who had forgotten how to hope. No crops yielded fruit. Even the animals died quietly, their bodies crumpled in fields where nothing grew. Amid the wailing and the long-forgotten prayers, the prophet became a shadowed figure. Some whispered that he had fled, others claimed they saw him roaming between distant hills like a ghost, but no one could say for certain. And then a new command came to Elijah, clear, unmistakable. This time he was not to hide, he was not to wait, he was to appear. The time for confrontation had come. Leaving behind the humble home that had sheltered him, Elijah turned toward the heart of devastation. He carried no sword, brought no army. All he held was the unshakable conviction that the voice which had guided him this far would not fail him now. On the road, he met a man named Obadiah, a palace official. Though he served in the royal courts, his heart remained faithful to the God of Israel. The sight of Elijah shocked him. He hadn't expected to lay eyes on the very man whom the king had sought so desperately, whom the nation spoke of in hushed awe. "Is it really you?" Obadiah asked, voice trembling. "Are you the one everyone's been searching for?" "I am," Elijah replied. "Go, tell your king that I am here." Fear flashed in Obadiah's eyes. He knew the king's rage. "If I go, and then the Spirit of God takes you away again, I'll be executed. Don't you know I've hidden 100 prophets in caves, kept them alive? Please don't put my life at risk." Elijah rested a steady hand on his shoulder. "As surely as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will show myself to the king today." Reassured, Obadiah left, and not long after, King Ahab arrived. His face twisted with anger, driven by the desperation of a man losing control. "So it's you," he spat. "You're the one who brought all this misery on Israel." Elijah didn't flinch. His eyes were unwavering, his voice like stone. "No, it is not I. It is you and your father's house. You abandoned the commands of the Lord and bowed to false gods." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in years, the king found no words. This man, this wanderer, this fugitive, spoke with a weight no one could deny. Then came Elijah's challenge. "Summon the people. Bring the prophets of Baal. Meet me at Mount Carmel." There would be no more hiding. One altar, one call, one answer. Let the true God reveal himself. And so it happened. Fire came down. Not metaphor, not symbol. Real consuming flame from the heavens. It scorched the offering, the stones, the water surrounding the altar. Before the eyes of an entire nation, the God of Israel answered, not with whispers, but with power. The people fell silent. No longer could they pretend not to know. Elijah's words, once dismissed, now echoed in every heart like a thunderclap of truth. The prophets of Baal, proud and confident just hours before, now trembled. Their robes were torn. Their chants had died on their lips. They had no answers, no signs, no fire, only shame. The crowd that once watched in confusion now moved with certainty, not hatred, but clarity. The lie would no longer rule over them. Elijah stepped forward, the same calm, unwavering in his voice. "Let none of them escape." The people obeyed. Every prophet of Baal was seized. They were taken to the river that ran below the mountain, where justice was carried out, not out of vengeance, but obedience to ancient command. These weren't just men. They were symbols of deception, manipulation, and spiritual decay. It was a hard moment. Some turned their faces away, others wept, but all knew this was necessary, not cruel, cleansing. And when it was done, the mountain stood still. A strange silence blanketed the hilltop. No songs, no cheers. Elijah stood unmoved, staring across the horizon. He did not lift his hands. He did not boast. The battle had ended, but the burden had just begun. He knew the battle was not over. The fire may have fallen, but the true turning point had just begun. Elijah approached the king, who had been watching from a distance, his face pale, his confidence hollowed. The prophet met his eyes, not with fury, not with triumph, but with solemn clarity. "Go now," Elijah said calmly. "Eat, drink, for a great rain is on its way." Ahab said nothing. He turned and walked away, shoulders heavy with a weight he couldn't explain. Perhaps deep down he understood. The drought hadn't begun with the skies, it had begun in his own heart, and in the throne room he shared with a queen of foreign gods. Elijah returned to the mountaintop alone. There were no crowds now, no altar, no spectacle, just a man, knees pressed to the earth, face bowed low, not calling for fire this time, but for water, not for glory, but for mercy. He sent his servant to look toward the sea. Once, nothing. Twice, silence. 3 times, still no change. But Elijah did not stop. Again, and again, until on the 7th time, the servant returned with a whisper of hope. "There's a cloud," he said, "barely the size of a hand, rising from the sea." Elijah stood at once. That was all he needed. "Go," he said with resolve. "Tell the king to prepare his chariot and ride. The storm is coming." As the servant descended the mountain, the sky began to stir. The horizon, once blistering blue, filled with deepening clouds. The air, once bone dry, turned damp with promise. A breeze arrived, not harsh but full, carrying the scent of rain. Thunder cracked across the hills, lightning arced through the darkening sky. Then, as if the heavens themselves had taken a deep breath, the first drops fell. They began softly, touching the earth like a gentle apology, but they grew, more urgent, more abundant. The storm swept in with power, rain pounded the land, soaking the cracked soil, filling the empty stream beds, awakening dormant seeds. The fields drank deeply. Hope took root again. Farmers dropped to their knees in the mud, hands lifted, tears streaming, not from fear, but from awe. After years of silence, heaven had spoken again, and it came not with judgment, but with restoration. Down the mountain Elijah ran, fueled not by pride, but by purpose. He outpaced the royal chariots not to boast, but because something within him surged with divine strength. The mission was not over. The rain had come, but a new storm was rising elsewhere. While the people rejoiced under open skies, a different kind of tempest gathered inside the palace. Not one of clouds, but of fury, the queen had heard. Word had reached her that her prophets, the men she fed at her table, her spiritual stronghold, had been struck down. She did not scream. She did not break the silence with violence. Instead, her vengeance slipped from her lips like venom. As they fell, so shall he. And before tomorrow's sun rises, Elijah will be dead. Her words were not a threat, they were a promise. And that promise traveled fast. The prophet who had faced down hundreds of false prophets, who had stood firm as fire descended, who had prayed and opened the skies, now trembled. Not because his faith had failed, but because he was still flesh and blood. Courage does not cancel fear. It merely chooses to act in spite of it. But this time, Elijah could not stand. He fled, not out of rebellion, but raw humanity. He left the city behind and headed south, deeper and deeper into isolation. Somewhere along the road, he stopped and turned to his servant. "Stay here," he said. Then he walked on, alone, into the desert. The sun scorched his back. With each step, the memory of Mount Carmel faded. The cheers, the fire, the rain, all felt distant now. What remained was exhaustion, fear, fragility. The wilderness was not merely a place outside the city, it was now inside him. At last, completely spent, Elijah collapsed beneath a lone desert shrub. The dust clung to his skin, and the silence pressed in around him like a suffocating shroud. In a whisper, the words escaped from deep within. "Lord, I've had enough. Take my life. I am no better than those who came before me." He asked for no victory. He did not crave glory or vindication. What he longed for was rest. The man who had stood before kings, called fire from heaven, and opened the skies through prayer, now sat alone, worn down to his very bones. It wasn't a sword that shattered his courage, not a battle nor betrayal. It was a single whispered threat, spoken with icy hatred, that pierced his soul and cracked his strength. And under that invisible weight, the prophet broke. He lay there, eyes closed, no longer asking for direction, but for release. But heaven did not answer with thunder. Instead, a gentle hand touched him, soft, unthreatening, and when Elijah opened his eyes, there stood a figure beside him, an angel, not bearing judgment, not with blazing fire or fearsome commands, just a quiet presence and simple words, "Get up and eat." Beside him was fresh bread, warm from the embers, and a jar of cool water. Elijah ate. He drank, and then, without a word, he lay back down. His body rested, but his soul still ached. Once more, the messenger returned. This time the voice, though still tender, carried a firmer tone. "Eat again. You have a long journey ahead." The food was not ordinary. It strengthened him beyond human limits. On that divine sustenance, he rose and walked, 40 days and 40 nights, through wilderness, over hills, across barren plains, not driven by direction, but by a quiet inner call. He didn't know the destination. He simply walked. Elijah had escaped the queen's wrath, but the battle he now faced was deeper, the weight of continuing. With every step, the memory of Mount Carmel grew distant. The fire, the rain, the altar, all seemed like another life. The prophet's feet were cracked and bloodied. The sun showed no mercy. The desert offered no comfort. And still he kept going, not because he felt strong, but because he couldn't ignore the voice that had once called him by name. He passed through lands untouched by greed, where only rock and dust stretched to the horizon. There were no miracles, no birds with bread, no angels in sight, just silence and pain. Eventually, he came upon a dry, lifeless patch where a single bush offered a sliver of shade. There he sank to the ground. His heart had nothing left to give. Eyes lifted to the heavens, not in hope, but in surrender. "I failed," he murmured. "I'm no different than the others. I'm afraid. I've had enough. Just take me." His words weren't angry, they were weary. He didn't ask for punishment, he begged for rest. Everything he had poured himself into seemed undone. Jezebel still ruled, the people still wavered, and he was exhausted. Laying his head on a stone, he closed his eyes, hoping they would stay closed forever. But God did not send judgment, he sent sleep. While Elijah rested, a heavenly messenger came again. No loud cries, no shining spectacle, just a quiet touch on his shoulder. A whisper, like a father speaking gently to a son who had reached the end of himself. "Get up and eat." Beside him again was warm bread and water. Elijah ate slowly, saying nothing. He still wasn't ready. His soul was too heavy to rise. But the angel returned once more. This time the words came with deep understanding and purpose. "Get up, eat again. The journey ahead of you is long." So he obeyed, not because he was full of strength, but because he recognized the voice. The same voice that had called him by the brook in the widow's home on the mountaintop. He ate, he drank, and then he stood. Something had shifted, not in his muscles, but in his spirit. A flicker had returned, not fire, but flame enough. And with that, he walked on, 40 days, 40 nights, guided not by certainty, but by obedience, not to escape anymore, but to be found. His steps led him to the sacred mountain, where generations before, fire and cloud had revealed the voice of the Almighty. Elijah had no idea what awaited him there, but something deep within told him this encounter would not be like the others. There would be no spectacle, no dazzling signs. What was coming would be as quiet as the breath of a weary soul, still choosing to believe. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was hallowed ground, where divinity had once thundered through smoke and stone, where a law was carved and a nation born trembling. Elijah now stood upon that same soil, not as a judge, but as a servant drained by the weight of obedience. He found shelter in a cave. Time became blurry, Silence thickened. Doubts whispered. Why continue? What was left to give? Was anyone still listening? Then a voice cut through the stillness. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It wasn't harsh, it wasn't angry. It was the kind of question that searches the deepest layers of a person. Elijah answered with raw honesty, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken your covenant, torn down your altars, and murdered your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to take my life too." There was no debate, no rebuke, just a request. "Go out and stand before me." And so Elijah did. What followed defied expectation. First came a windstorm, fierce enough to shatter cliffs, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, raw, trembling power, but God was not there either. After that, fire raged across the horizon, but even in the flames, the Lord remained silent. Then came a whisper, a fragile sound, barely audible, but in it, Elijah felt the nearness of something sacred. It wasn't noise, it was nearness. He pulled his cloak over his face. He knew God was there. Again, the